What is the near future of surveillance? Of cloud computing? What is the near future?
Thanks. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. It's great to see so many of you here tonight. And for those of you who are parked off to the left, there are some seats. If you're brave enough to come down the front to my right, then if you want a comfortable seat and a very good view, you can come down here. But it's entirely up to you. Good evening. My name is Tim Parsons. I'm chair of the Designed Objects programs here within the Department of Architecture, Interior Architecture and Designed Objects at SAIC. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Bruce Tharp back to SAIC. But before I introduce Bruce, I want to just make a couple of announcements. Sorry. Thank you. Yeah. Let me just, I'll just adjust it a bit like that. Is that better? Okay, I'll just slouch slightly. Okay, so our next Mitchell lecture, as you can see on the screen, is next Thursday here, same time, same place. And it's by Sarah Carter, who's an amazing writer, historian, and lecturer. And she'll be telling us about her book, Object Lessons, How 19th Century Americans Learned to Make Sense of the World. And it's literally about the phrase object lesson that I'm sure many of you have heard of, and how that evolved from literally having objects in the classroom as a tool for learning. So I think in relation to what we do in the department here, it's really a fascinating way of understanding how objects can operate in the world, which is something we're going to be talking about tonight as well. And I also want to invite you to an opening. Bodies is an exhibition curated by AIADO lecturer Megan Newker, who's in the audience. Just give us a wave, Megan, over there. Great. And Megan has put this show together with students from her Introduction to Design Objects courses from the past few semesters. And in response, it's at the International Museum of Surgical Science. And the students responded to the IMSS's collection to design assistive devices intended to increase accessibility, promote healthy behaviors, create comfort, or improve safety. So the reception is tomorrow evening at 5:30. Please sign up on the website at imss.com/bodies. And the show is on until February. And also I want to draw your attention to a lecture on Monday at the Art Institute. Phantom Mise as Rendered Society by André Jacques, Backstage Notes on Collecting Architecture. So this is a lecture in reference to the fascinating installation that is currently on show within the permanent collection in the modern wing. And the curator Maite Borjabad will be in conversation with André Jacques. So, back to tonight, and Bruce Tharp is a man of many talents, a Renaissance man, if you will. As his bio tells us, he is believed to be the first industrial designer to receive a PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago. Before that, he earned a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering from Bucknell University and a Master's degree in Industrial Design from Pratt in New York. And in between his schooling, he served as a captain in the US Army, looking after America's nuclear weapons in Germany, would you believe? After researching the future of work in the workplace for Hayworth's design research think tank, the Ideation Group, he began his career teaching. So over the past 15 years, he's been a tenured professor here at SAIC, at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and currently at the University of Michigan's Penny Stamp School of Art and Design. And his and Stephanie Tharp's award-winning studio Materius has exhibited internationally, licensed designs for local and global companies, and self-produced commercial, experimental, and discursive products. And Bruce was my predecessor here at SAIC, and alongside Helen Maria Nugent, the two of them really shaped and positioned the Design Objects program as a broad and progressive design program. And this is a legacy that we're very proud of and keen to live up to in the future. And this breadth of outlook is perfectly encapsulated by an article that he and Stephanie wrote for Core 77 in January 2009, which is still up on Core 77's site, and I suggest you all read it. The title of it is "The Four Fields of Industrial Design: No, Not Furniture, Transport, Consumer Electronics and Toys." And the thesis was that design does itself a great disservice by using a diffuse array of terms to describe its activity. Terms that Bruce and Stephanie argued that people in the field of design barely understand, never mind those outside who were trying to engage. So by boiling these down to just four: commercial design, responsible design, experimental design, and discursive design, the field becomes a lot more legible. Now, inheriting his syllabi, I noticed immediately how he had embedded these fields, this four-field approach, into his courses. And some of the students, upon hearing this, I imagine that they're getting at least some resonance, because it's this aim of introducing a broad range of fields is still very prevalent in the courses we're teaching today. So tonight we're going to focus on discursive design, the topic of this hefty tome, Discursive Design, Critical, Speculative and Alternative Things. It's published by MIT Press, $39.95. Good value in paper alone. And so Bruce is going to briefly introduce the topic, and this will be followed by a discussion with me and, I hope, plenty of questions from you. So please join me in welcoming Bruce Tharp. Thanks, Bruce.
Okay, I'll get this, try and beat out the train. So thank you very much for inviting me. There's a special place in my heart for SAIC, as it was as Tim mentioned, where I first started teaching. And I'm slightly embarrassed that I started teaching in 2005, and in 2007, as part of my tenure process, I had to give a presentation. And during that presentation, that was in 2007, I announced that I was going to start working on a book on discursive design. So here it is, 12 years later, that I finally got around to doing it, and it sort of comes full circle. So tonight I'll say we and I'll say I a lot, but really that you should take that as meaning with my wife Stephanie Tharp as well. So the ideas and all our practice are really melded together. We teach together at Stamps and the University of Michigan. We have a studio together. We wrote the book together. We eat dinner together every night. So it's very much her work as well, and I tend to end up I end up doing a little bit more of the public speaking than she does. But we have two daughters, and so it's kind of rare for us to be seen in the same place after 5 o'clock together. So. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about. So as Tim mentioned, I've got a little bit of, maybe for about 25 minutes, I'll be talking just a little bit about some background and some basics, and then it's going to turn into a little bit of a discussion and Q&A. And whatever we talk about, I know Tim's got some questions that he sort of shared that he, thinking about asking, but we can begin to think about how this turns out in practice, what the future of the field is, and maybe even the book project itself, what that was like, because it was certainly a little bit of a saga. So in getting going, if we think this discursive design project, so 14 years, sort of peeling back the layers of the onion, sort of what's at the core of where did this whole project start? And it's Helen Marie Nugent. So some of you your students probably don't know this image, but those faculty and staff will recognize HM. So she was key to, as Tim said, with the undergrad and grad product designed objects program. So in 2004, right across the street there, we had coffee, and she convinced me to leave my dream job working at at Hayworth, their ideation. The ideation group was very much a sort of exciting think tank where you could kind of show up to work whenever you wanted, wear whatever you wanted, and really got to work with an exciting group of people. So I gave that all up to come and help sort of start the Designed Objects program. So that was, so I was leaving industry and coming to teach for the first time, and it was a week and a half before school started, and I got an email with a proposed syllabi, and in that syllabi, it had the terms propositional, speculative, and instigative as types of approaches to designed objects. So I emailed HM back and said, oh, do you have any definitions of these terms that are in this syllabi? Because, I'd like to address them appropriately, in the class that I'm teaching for the first time. Well, it turned out there weren't. So I sort of took on the goal of sort of trying to make sense of these as distinct approaches, sort of, and using them in my early teaching. And I kind of went back and I found this as one of the a syllabus, the first page of the syllabus, where even the core design studio was called propositional, speculative, and instigative objects. So I could have kind of left these three terms alone to sort of common understandings or individual interpretations, and that may have been what was in play before I got here. But this being faced with this sort of rekindled a little bit of the frustration that I had when I was a design student at Pratt Institute, and actually Stephanie had the same experience when she was at RISD. So we both had undergraduate degrees in mechanical engineering, and that's sort of a well-established, robust foundation for that education. And we're a little bit frustrated with that there wasn't more available to help designers do conceptual types of design, and that's the kind of work that was being done. And at Pratt and RISD, and I think pretty much the same. It's still that way for the most part. So the teaching model was look at some examples, go take a stab at it yourself, and come back and we'll do a critique. And that's not how you design bridges. So we were a little kind of frustrated with that process. So teaching at SAIC, I was doing a lot of graduate advising with fine artists and also the architect students and interior architect students and the design object students. And I was sort of struggling with teaching this conceptual work. And this is where we're going to overlap a little bit with what Tim had mentioned in terms of that article, which I tend to talk a lot about even though it's an old article, but it really sort of sets up the framing of this. And so we began this process of collecting all these different types of design that we came across, both academically and popularly, and basically tried to make sense of them. And the problem is it's an ever-growing list with our field, and they were boiled down into these three areas. And the article that Tim had mentioned, we talked about the fields of design. And it's nice for alliteration, the four fields of design. We tend to talk more now about sort of primary design agendas. There's a little bit of less, it makes a little bit more sense, we've found, and there's a little less resistance to this thing being a larger field. So, of course, commercial design is focused around profit. Responsible design is about socially responsible design, and the goal there is forms of service. Experimental design inquiry, and discursive design is reflection. So I'm just going to show some examples really quick for those who this is new to, which I'm sure there are. So obviously, here we have the iPhone is commercial. This is something called a Lorm glove that helps people who are both deaf and blind to communicate. This is an electronic glove that works with a cell phone. This is done by David Mellis at the MIT Media Lab, and this is really looking at the implications of digital fabrication on open source hardware and DIY practice. And actually, he used this phone for several years. He might actually still be using this phone. And lastly, with discursive design, this goal of reflection, and this is a project called Social Mobiles done by IDEO, and this was done in the early 2000s, when cell phones were just, being part of being found in public space, and some of the challenges that were around with that. So the idea here is we have 4 mobile electronic communication devices, 4 phones in a way, but very different agendas. And so this is kind of the thing that we were beginning to wrestle with a little bit when we started teaching. So it's less about what we design and how we design, but getting more to this core about why we're designing. And that's what we begin to think of these as these primary agendas that a designer might have. And over the years, this is in the book, but over the years we started to use this tool, which was sort of helpful for the number one question that we would get on this is, what about the overlap between these, these areas? They seem so distinct. Well, this addresses the kind of the hybridity of it, and so this it's a sort of a simple mapping that we have our students do a lot, and basically each quadrant, one is for commercial, one is responsible, one experimental and discursive, and you can be none, low, medium, high, and you begin to use that to help frame out the project, what you're intending to do with the project, because we find it's when students have this sort of freedom to begin to think very broadly, things get kind of messy pretty quick. So this helps them actually do the kind of work, and we found it being very helpful also with interdisciplinary work as well, when you have different people coming to a project together and they have sort of different motivations and agendas for doing that kind of work. And it's actually found also it's good for multidisciplinary critiques as well, when especially like here at SAIC, where you have, at least with the grad program, we have artists and the whole faculty critiquing grad students. We found that it's helpful, like at STAMPS, where we have artists that are, assume that if you're doing a design project that it's commercially oriented. So, okay, so just to be sure where we are here, we're defining discursive design, coming from the term discourse, as this sort of means by which artifacts are used to address substantive topics of psychological, sociological, and ideological import. So these topics, ideas, are issues. They're considered discourses, which we define as systems of thought or knowledge, and the way this is framed out is this is a form of discourse through design. So these artifacts are carrying, or they're embodied with, they're transporting, transmitting these larger discourses. So I'm going to show just a couple of, or a few examples of this, just to make sure we're all on the same page. And some of these are more historic, and I've kind of picked ones that might actually be more familiar with people that are actually, maybe some people that read Time magazine, but so this is the first one. So this is going way back to 2001, and this is James Auger and Jim Luzo's audio tooth implant. So the idea here is this uses bone transduction to transmit sound from mobile devices, for example. So I don't need headphones anymore. I pull out my molar, and I can put this in there, and it communicates with my phone or other electronic devices, and I hear through bone transduction. So in their words, the audio tooth implant is a conceptual proposition intended to encourage discourse and comment on the possibilities of biotechnology and its potential impact on society and culture. And here it is on the cover of Time magazine, which is a whole nother story. But so this is a project by Drone. It's called Drone Aviary by Superflux. So they're out of the UK. Also, I think in India is on their website. They're both. In their words, the Drone Aviary is an investigation of the social, political, and cultural potential of drone technology as it enters civil space. Through a series of ongoing installations, films, and publications, the project aims to give a glimpse into a near-future city cohabitating with intelligent, semi-autonomous, networked flying machines. So it hints at a world where the network begins to gain physical autonomy, moving through and making decisions about the world, influencing our lives in often opaque and yet profound ways. So it's very much a cautionary vision, and there's a video that goes along with this as well, that you kind of get the drone's eye view of what's going on, which is really sort of unnerving. This is a project by Augie Haynes called Transfigurations. And these are wax babies. So the product here is the baby, the human body. So it's looking at the future of bioengineering with the technology that we have available today. And so in her words about this specific baby, there are 5 in the series, extending the skin on the scalp increases the surface area for faster heat dissipation. With the increase in global warming, this child would be able to withstand working in high temperatures due to the higher number of veins near the surface of the skin. So these are ethical issues surrounding the choices that parents will make, that children will have to live with, and the far-reaching implications for social life, for the haves and the have-nots, right? Who can afford this in the future, and are they they're given another sort of leg up? So so this is more than a product, and it's looking at technology and biology and the future implications of bioengineering. Again, this stuff is she designed it, so these are things that could happen now. And this is the last project that I'll show here just as an example. And this is one of the most ambitious projects, a team of designers organized by the Near Future Laboratory. So this is 66 fictional products and 62 farcical ads. And this is the TBD catalog. So I'll just...
What is the near future of surveillance, of cloud computing? What is the near future of open source education? Will there be beer in the future? Beef jerky? What will stress us out? We created a design fiction product catalog. It was not a means to predict the future. It was a means to suggest it, to imply it, to discuss it. By creating objects, the products and services that would be part of a possible near future world.
So, as it mentions at the end, it's a mean to suggest, imply, and discuss the future. So if you look at the projects that I just showed you, the Tooth project was originally and sort of still called an example of design, of critical design. The drone project and the babies are described as speculative design, and the TBD catalog you just heard be described as an example of design fiction.
What is the near future?
So that's a bit of the rub that we have with a relatively young field. So this diagram is getting at the idea that we see discursive design as a broad umbrella category that includes many of these other types of design, sort of historical and contemporary as well. So there's a little bit of a genus-species relationship, and certainly this list could grow as the field develops. And certainly some of these on here are in a way dead. You might say dead already, died off. But these are certainly ones that are most familiar: critical design, design fiction, and speculative design. So, and we also see the possibility for, potentially in the future, looking at subspecies as well. Now, a lot of people begin to think design fiction is really a sort of a subspecies of speculative design. So I think as time goes on, all of this will sort of sort its way out. But there's a little bit of an issue with what things are called, and but we're very much thinking this as very broadly as this umbrella term. So within sort of all the issues of the book, I'm going to pull out just one sort of framework and just walk through that a little bit. And it deals with the domains, what we call the domains of discursive design. So these are 4 areas where we see discursive design currently working, and also sort of on the horizon, on the cusp, or kind of working already. So we certainly imagine this list could grow as the field matures. 2 of these are research-based, and 2 of them are practice-based. So, and I'll just show some brief examples of them. So, the first one is social engagement. So, and this is the most prevalent way that discursive design has operated in the world, and sort of operates now historically. This is where it's kind of closest to forms of art in terms of how it's disseminated, and also some of the final outcomes. So this can also be thought as a kind of activist mode of working, where the goal is to engage society somehow. Usually, the broader the messaging, the better. So I'm going to show some examples of this. There are certainly, thousands probably, and I'm going to stick to ones that are a little bit more, a little unique in terms of being related to corporations or commercial context, because that's a little bit more unique. So. This one is sort of an older historic project done by a design firm called Stewart Carton Design in California, and it was sort of a series of I think 10 projects that they did. And this is kind of a Tamagotchi of the future. And basically, all of the projects in this in this series, so we're really looking at this idea of the question of just because we can, should we? Now, this example of a corporation that's doing this kind of work, it's social engagement, but they're also sort of getting this branding bump as part of the process. This is called NaturePod, and this is Stuart Candy, his project at the Situation Lab, and this is one he did with students at the Ontario College of Art and Design. So the project is, in their words, what if you could reap the health benefits of spending time in nature for productivity, creativity, and stress relief without ever leaving your office? All this is coming soon to a cubicle near you. Now, this was actually funded by Interface Flooring, a large flooring company, but their name is nowhere associated with this at all. So it's really, they believed in this project and they kind of put money behind it. But largely, what's significant about this is they presented this work at the largest trade show for architecture, interior architecture in Canada, and it's all fundamentally a farce, right? They presented this as if this was a product that was, coming next year, and it was sort of, in some ways, basically, it's a little bit of an immersive experience where you have these headphones and you're looking into this. This digital imagery of nature, essentially. So it's a very unique project and has, maybe some ethical implications to the ruse that was going on, but interesting in that way, especially because it's funded by a corporation. This one, a lot of you may be familiar with. This is the Museum of the Future. This is the 2015 version of this. And this is probably the largest or the one with the biggest budget with it. So this is noted as the first of its kind. The museum goes far beyond written reports and special effects. It highlights real prototypes and prospective services that could be developed by governments of tomorrow. The museum will be the largest ever use of design fiction, the practice of using design to explore future possibilities in creative and engaging ways. So big project, and they finished the actual museum, I think, last year or the year before. And this one is
Arranged is a board game that forces participants to confront the struggles of an arranged marriage. The culture of arranged marriage. Arranged is a board game that forces participants.
I just wanted to kind of show that the initial part of that. So she's just using Kickstarter as a platform to begin to discuss arranged marriages. So this is a board game that she did. So in this, she's, quote, hoping that people will have a conversation about it, quote, it provides a platform for people to be able to discuss the issue. And that's the nature and approach of this social engagement work. So it's a common domain, and again, I've tried to show it a little bit more of some of the expansive ways that it's used beyond or practiced beyond sort of the singular designer doing this kind of work, which is largely how it's been done. So we'll move on to applied research. And so applied research, so we know there's been a growth in design research within the design field. And this, when we say design research, we really mean sort of applied research. And so if we think of typical evaluation research in design, right, I show a prototype to an audience, potential users, and I get ergonomic, aesthetic, or usability kind of feedback from them. That sort of helps me in that process. The same thing can happen with discursive design, but what you're usually testing is people's values, attitudes, and beliefs. So discursive design is really good for sort of nudging and poking at that type of things, which typical prototypes generally are not so good at doing. So this is sometimes known as provocative probes or provocative prototyping. And what happens is you have discursive design that's embedded in a larger process, and usually it's a research process that may actually serve corporate agendas, for example. And I'm going to show a couple of those, or just talk very briefly about a couple of one. So Philips Design is one of the companies that has been doing this. They actually stopped this program, but for a while they had this design probes program that was fairly robust. And Microsoft, Intel, larger corporations have sort of had the resources to employ designers to work in this way. But this is a project that Philips had, and it's called the Electronic Tattoo Project. I'm just going to show you very briefly because it's a long, fairly slow, and somewhat boring video. But the idea is that there's this addressable subcutaneous ink where that's activated by human touch or just any touch, I guess. So it kind of goes on like that, and it's kind of creepy. But what they did is they showed those videos to public. They elicited feedback, and they were able to come up with some insights. What was really surprising to them is what they found is the overwhelming concern was that they were worried about corporations could hack their bodies. They weren't worried about the safety of it. So it's really what he mentions here, this very, very, very strong, heartfelt anxiety that people have about this relationship with corporations. So they're not in the addressable ink business, but this was research they did to help understand their company in relation to society. This is a project done by Strange Telemetry, and their description of it in their words, Strange Telemetry worked with members of the public to generate evidence for the Government Office for Science Foresight project that explored the challenges and opportunities of an aging society. This project marks the first active use of speculative design in the UK government policy processes. So as you may be able to see here, they basically created a bunch of these visual posters about the built environment, and they were able to show them to the elderly. So they have designed objects here, interior architecture, architecture, and even urban design that they're working with. So these were tools that facilitated conversations that ultimately led to the government understanding better the values, attitudes, and beliefs of this elderly population. So this helps them in policy making. So this third area is basic research. So basic research is also understood as academic research or pure research, and the idea is you're producing new knowledge, so general principles without necessarily a specific mandate for application in the world. So with basic research, most of this is being done actually on discursive design itself right now with PhD programs or PhD students that are working on this project. So they're actually doing basic research on a discursive design. The other relation is that a lot of times discursive designers are supporting the dissemination of basic research, so other academics' basic research. So this is a public engagement for science and public engagement with science and technology. So PES or PEST is what this is known as. And actually, Stephanie's working on a project right now on chronic pain at the University of Michigan that's very much a PEST project where it's an NIH grant, and they're working with doctors on how to get the public to understand a little bit more some of the perceptions about people with chronic pain. But it's really the third area that I think is on the horizon, and this is the idea where discursive design can actually contribute to actual basic research and how it's conducted and the actual production of knowledge. So not just sort of helping disseminate knowledge that's already out there, but the act of producing new knowledge. And this probably would be done with provocative prototyping, and it sort of limited the type of basic research that probably could be done. But this we see as being on the horizon, and again, collaboration with other researchers to employ discursive design to help produce new knowledge. And the last areas, this is a little bit on the horizon, perhaps, depending on how you begin to see the world. And so practical application is where there's an orientation towards practice, and there's a distinct operative goal. So discursive design is usually not about getting actual utility out of the object, right? They're usually rhetorical, and they're there to make us think. But in this domain, that reflection is more practical and directly useful. And so we can think of this as being used in therapy, counseling, coaching, public policy, and in deliberative democracy, right? It can help inform constituents about possible outcomes prior to a vote. So here's something that begins to visualize if we vote A, here's something that begins to visualize if we vote B, and okay, so now we've engaged with those, now let's go and vote. So that type of arrangement. So I just have one example of what that could be. Now this is a project that was called the Euthanasia Coaster, and it was done in, I think, 2010, and is fairly had a bit of success in other realms. But the idea here is that, well, I'll read the description. It's a hypothetic death machine in the form of a roller coaster engineered to humanely, with elegance and euphoria, take the life of a human being. So the idea is if you want rather than putting a plastic bag on your head and hooking it up to 2 helium tanks that you got from Party Time, which is how people do this today, and I think every day someone commits suicide this way, that here's, you would actually go on this roller coaster and have this sort of euphoric experience, but still the outcome would be the same, that you would be dead at the end of the roller coaster based on the engineering that's involved. So this is a project that's done for social engagement. We imagine how it might be, though, applied in this practical application if you want to begin to have end-of-life conversations with people. So you can imagine a counselor that might sort of prescribe someone to basically engage with a project like this. So there was actually, someone did like I think a 15-minute really high production value video of a billionaire that actually made one of these machines. So it really had sort of some cultural relevance and all these sort of offshoots from his essentially his model that he made here. And this is something I found just the other day, November 6th. So how hypothetical designs can help us think through our conversations about euthanasia. So this is exactly the kind of thing that I was sort of imagining that this euthanasia coaster could be used at. And so here's a designer in the UK who's working in that very same way. So might counselors, healthcare professionals sort of prescribe discursive design? That's sort of the implication here with these sort of end-of-life projects. And this is something that I'm working on with my own research right now. I'm working with 2 neurologists and a palliative care physician and a bioethicist and an somebody who does art therapy, and we're really looking at how discursive design specifically can help people have these sort of end-of-life conversations that become very important because 25% of our Medicare funding goes to the last year of life, which seems pretty incredible. So the idea of length of life versus quality of life, those are the kind of questions. So we have these 4 domains. So this is one of the things that we begin to talk about in the field, basically just to open it up a little bit. So I'm going to end here just with a little bit of framing the book. What's unique about it in a way is that it has 2 parts. There's part 1 and part 2. Part 1 is theory, part 2 is practice. And the idea, as design educators, we know that designers are often visual learners, and so the book was designed so someone who's a visual learner can actually read part 2 first, because it's mostly project-based, and it points you to some of the deeper writing that's in part 1. So the idea is you can read it sort of like a normal book with part 1, and actually maybe even skip part 2, because part 2 just enforces part 1. Or if you're a visual learner, you can start with part 2 and engage with the first part. So that's something that's a little bit unique about the approach to the book. But this is sort of the images from the first part, but you see, even though it's sort of the theory stuff, there's images and call-outs and things like that. Now this, it seems like some of you might be able to read this. Hopefully I'll be able to pull this up during our discussion, because I want to be able to point to this. But this is a content map. So this is addressing sort of all of in addition to the table of contents, this is sort of getting at a lot of the frameworks and the language that we're presenting with the project. So and there's one space of that is just sort of the domains that I mentioned. But one of the focus of the book is really these core chapters, 11 to 9. These 9 chapters that deal with these 9. What we call facets of design. You can see that it basically takes us 10 chapters to get to the meat of the book. So the idea here is we're trying to provide a really strong foundation, which is something we think was missing with the existing literature about where this stuff, what's a strong foundation for this kind of work. So. And the last thing I'll mention is that Stephanie was able to get a decent grant to do a database project. So we are in the sort of final stages, probably I think it's going to be next semester. It'll be ready for prime time, but basically it's a database of discursive design projects, and we've got things like themes that they're organized by themes. There are projects and designers and chronological, and there's even sort of this map, and you can see it's sort of only partially done here. That begins where you can begin to see some of the connections between the projects and the themes as well. So it's something that that we're interested. I think it's going to start with about 200 projects, but we're looking for designers to be able to contribute this as well. So when it's done, we're interested in people being able to load up their own projects to make it sort of a meaty, worthwhile research, essentially a research tool. So, and if you want. So some of the diagrams from the book are on discursivedesign.com, and also if you click on there, there's something that you can get on a mailing list. So when the database is done, that will let you know when the database is finished, and then the database is going to be at discursive.design, and this is how you can contact me. So thank you, and hopefully we'll be able to refer back to this. So.
Thanks very much, Bruce. And
Okay.
I mean, first of all, congratulations on the book and such a journey to get there.
Yes.
Could we put the lights up a little bit? Is that okay? Cool, thanks. So I'll kick off with a few questions, but I'm sure you've got some brewing, and I'll transition, and I won't hog the conversation. Sort of going back to the kind of genus and species kind of definition that you had for discursive design, I also wanted to ask a bit about the sort of historical lineage. You mentioned there were a few older terms there, but I mean, it seems to me to owe a lot to the sort of radical design of the 60s and 70s. I mean, is that how you see it, or are there other reference points for you, kind of historically?
I think I agree that radical design is kind of the biggest movement that sort of that we can kind of point to, and I think it's fairly conventional. I mean, when you read about histories of this, they almost always go back to that as a starting point, and I think Matthew Malpass in his book he was able to sort of introduce some other things that I hadn't seen before, so I think his history is pretty good. But I would say yes, the radical design is a lot of where we can begin to point to that historically. If the diagram that I showed, in a way, we imagine it potentially being more taxonomic than what it actually is. It's basically there to begin to spell out some of the this notion of the umbrella category, because this is one of the things that was a bit of a challenge when we first started this, because Anthony Dunn, Fiona Raby's, or actually Anthony Dunn's Hertzian Tales, which spelled out in 1999, which sort of spelled out critical design, was out there in the world, and we started to use it when we first started teaching, and we started to talk about this area as critical design, and what we found is that the more that we went along, the harder it was to sort of stick with that term, and largely because they defined it, or he defined it at that time. It was posed against the marketplace, and we saw some limitations with that. He was defined specifically about electronic objects, which we could probably get over and see how it applies to other things, but it was defined in that way. And also it was, it's the issue of critical design and critical theory that was kind of baked into that as well, which we thought was also limiting in a way, because we think of critical theory in terms of emancipation and enlightenment and this sort of radical, or not radical, but social change, and it just was kind of clear that didn't really speak to all of the flavors of this. So we were kind of stuck with having to think of, what might we begin to call this, and so discursive design became what we felt was a category that was helpful, in doing that. But I think the fact that people, there's critical design and then speculative design, and now, people are, now, speculative critical design, which I think speaks to the fact that there's something problematic with the terminology there. When critical design wasn't enough, and speculative design came along, and we're going to squish those two together and call it, this other thing. So I think that points to some of the challenges. But yeah, so that's sort of the naming was actually sort of something that we struggled with in terms of where it is. But we decided to take more of a this sort of umbrella approach to the project. So like I said, there are 15 on there, but some of them are like radical design on there, which have sort of passed.
Sure. I mean, just as a matter of interest, did you invent the term discursive design, or was it in use previously?
The only example of it we found was in the area of deliberative democracy, where they were using it as within deliberative democracy, political science, to begin to talk about actually having conversations with people in order to create policy, which was something somewhat radical in that field, rather than policy coming from from above. So that was the only reference to it. That we hadn't found a design reference to it as well, and it was kind of helpful that it's kind of a strange term. It's not something that people necessarily know what discursive means. So it had a little bit of a freshness, or a little bit of a clean slate that, like, conceptual design, doesn't have. Right? They're all different conceptions of what conceptual design is and how industry uses it. So it was a little bit of a blank slate, which was sort of helpful in some ways, and problematic in others. So. Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the things I have really enjoyed about the book is the way that I think in academia it's quite common for academics to come up with a new term and then want to own it and protect it. And in a way, I sort of get the impression, that's the feeling I first got when I read Hertzian Tales. I was very excited about critical design, but I also felt that Dunn and eventually Raby as well were kind of wanting to own that to an extent, and obviously, educate their students in it. But the book, I think, does a good job of being critical about discursive design, as well as really going into a lot of depth about what it is and what it can be. So I think that was kind of a refreshing element. But I wanted to ask about it from a point of view of impact. You also make some fairly big claims about like what discursive design could do. Socio-cultural transformation being one that is of the biggest, really. When you think about increasing the reach of and improving the reception for discursive design, what does that kind of look like to you?
Well, the issue about sociocultural transformation, I mean, we're kind of explicit about the challenge of that, and that's one of our criticisms of it. So it's, again, a little bit of a tough space where we're critical of that kind of claim, because this is when if you go back to critical design and critical theory and the idea that it is about emancipation, enlightenment, and this change, then you would have to kind of say that all critical design has failed. Because I'm not sure that any of it has actually led to sociocultural change. So that's one of the reasons why there's a chapter, there's a chapter on impact, which I don't know if we can actually read that so well, but that sort of dealt with this sort of three sort of tiers of impact that you could have. And the first is the level of thinking, the other one is level of action, and then the other one is on institutional change. So the idea that we don't necessarily have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, that it's cautionary, saying it's really hard to do this because you obviously lose the ability to influence others, so the death of the author, you lose that influence, but still, why shouldn't we be sort of, shooting for that, right? If we, can we begin to participate in that, in that way? So I'm teaching a class now on discursive design, and the topic for the class is we're dealing with reparations. And so I think about like Ta-Nehisi Coates' article for The Atlantic on a case for reparations. And we could probably look at that article and seeing how it is actually made. It's had a pretty strong cultural impact. I mean, academics have argued about the reparations issue. In fact, 20 years ago, many of the black academics sort of, hey, we've already had this conversation. Why are we bringing it up again? We've come to the conclusions, and they're not going to change. But I see his article as sort of working in that way, and it makes me think that design might be able to do the same thing. So he's actually tapping into, and maybe it's sort of nudging or triggering this sort of things that are already in play. But in the book we use it. There's an example called Taxidus. So there's a Dutch designer, and it's a online game, and it's a game that it's about you take the role of a corporation, and your goal is to find international tax shelters for your company. And so what happened is, they basically this game had some popularity, and it turned out that the Netherlands was like a great place to hide taxes or to shelter money. And that game actually then got the issue brought up in the Dutch parliament to actually discuss their relationship with international corporations. So for me, I actually don't know the degree or at all that the laws actually changed. But for me, it shows the possibility that that design might be able to to work in that way and actually achieve a kind of a kind of cultural change, but most of it won't. Just like most articles in the Atlantic don't. Right? So it's a relatively rare, I think, rare event. But so cautious about making great claims, but also trying to be somewhat positive about the possibility, that's out there. So.
Yeah, I want to sort of stay with that notion of impact a little bit longer, because I think that. It seems that a certain amount of discursive design, I think because of its sort of non-traditionally utilitarian use, has been thought of as being within the realm of the gallery. Yeah. But many of the examples you use exist beyond that. And we can also, the Atlantic article is one example, but also, the extent to which we see scenarios played out in Hollywood and on television and with the likes of Black Mirror, etc. Yeah. It seems like there are many, many other venues where this kind of work can appear, but it seems to be still relatively young as a field. So, what do you think needs to change or could be improved to increase its impact?
Yeah, I think that part of it, I think, is like doing it better. Right, that's one part of it. I think we can do better, and this is sort of also a little bit of an argument for research in this arena to make it more robust. So I think that's something that we can begin to control. But I also think it's slowly happening in a way, like whether it's Black Mirror, some of these other things that we're beginning to see artifacts operating in this way in the world. So I think people are to at least some extent getting a little bit more comfortable with that possibility. It's still not in the fore, but I think I think we're moving in that direction. So I think it's going to happen. I mean, the fact that like wanting to happen right away, it seems a little. It's a relatively young field. I mean, how many fields can sort of begin to claim to have this sort of major social impact? So it's kind of been around 20 years. But I think that this is where I think, though, that strategic foresight is helping out quite a bit. So strategic foresight has been used in corporations for decades. It's something that's relatively well understood and valued, and its connection now with speculative design, I think, is really beginning to move some of that into the at least corporate consciousness, and then maybe public consciousness as well. So part of it is just, I think we can do better on our end, but part of it's just time in exposure, so people are more open to that kind of possibility. So I just think it's like evolution versus like revolution.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting parts of the book for me was, on the subject of doing it better. There's a chapter that highlights the 7 discursive sins designers are guilty of, being ignorance, arrogance, insensitivity, laziness, cowardice, self-delusion, and negativity. So, which one are we most guilty of?
So actually, we're sort of working through some of the criticisms they have, and it turned out that there were 7 of them. We said made this connection. Oh, there's something interesting there, and it's a way to be, potentially be more provocative and sort of posing it in that way, because obviously there's a morality, and who are we to say what the sins are? But it also gets at the the idea that these are sins that we're all sort of naturally predisposed to, and so but. I think there are a couple. I mean, one of the ones that we talk a lot about. So we specify them in that one chapter, but they exist through the discussion throughout. And I think understanding is a big one in terms of like why should we care what a designer thinks about any of these issues, right? We're not experts in this, so like why would someone care, right? Why would someone value our perspective on this? So. This issue of understanding, I think, helps us. If we want to, the argument partly is, if we want to participate in a different way in social discourse, then there are responsibilities that come with that. And largely, we look at that as being an understanding some of these topics. It's really easy to sort of get on the bandwagon, but the degree to which we can actually have a conversation and defend. Or one of the things that, like, are we actually doing more harm than good, thinking that we're doing good because we're actually partially misinformed? This is somewhat relevant. So the class that I'm teaching right now, and we're dealing with reparations. We started out, and one of the things I do is have them do a political compass, which sort of puts them on sort of in a quadrant in terms of progressive and conservative and in economic terms, right and left. It turns out we're all in the same progressive quadrant, which is a little frustrating, but that's where we all are. But one of the things that, and there's another one as well that we do, but when I pose this question at the very beginning of the class, how many people are pro-reparations, every single hand went up, and we had a discussion about why it was such a good idea. After we spent over 3 weeks, I mean, essentially the class was a seminar, and after the 3+ weeks, asked the same questions, and none of the hands went up. So through this investigation, they completely changed their perspective on this. And also, in many surveys, 40% of blacks are anti-reparations as well. And there's a lot. The issue is that there's a lot of. It's a really complicated issue, and there's a lot of. There's a lot to begin to unpack. And so this for me was an example of where if they were just saying, oh yeah, let's go ahead and let's be on a pro-reparations platform, when actually if they spent some time looking at it, they actually changed their perspective on it. What the projects are turning into is a little bit is actually unpacking the complexity of it. So it's not that they're denying some of the issues that are the black-white race relations and the problems there. It's just the issue, the complexity of the enacting a reparations plan. So they're getting that complex. But that's a perfect example of how it's really easy to sort of get on the bandwagon, do one way. So understanding would be one of the primary ones for designers. Because academics spend 30, 35 years unpacking these super complicated issues, and who are we to kind of show up and kind of throw our hat in the ring. So for me, there's a responsibility, right? If this stuff can have an impact, then we need to be careful about and responsible in our perspective on it. And we should be able to have a dialogue about the pros and cons. And so I always have students, they have to do, any position they take, they have to do counter-narrative and counter-argument. So they have to know the other side of the equation in order to have a dialogue with someone about it. Because hopefully that's where they're going, is that they're at some point be able to engage with someone else in some of these ideas and getting them to reflect. So the other side of that too is that a lot of times you end up preaching to the choir. And so that's another one of the echo chamber problem where that you're talking about a project that everyone begins to agree with, then that's probably not the audience. That's not your audience. You're not really getting people to reflect or getting where they might actually have change of perceptions necessarily. So part of it's like you have to get into the audience that may actually be counter to where you yourself stand. So.
Yeah, I mean, that touches on what will be my last question before coming to the audience, so get ready. You mentioned this, the need to be well informed, and I think, there's, if in case you hadn't come across it, there has been a sort of fairly noisy and bad-tempered critique of certain strands of discursive design over the last few years, and I think the arguments, some of them have had a certain validity, but there's been an awful lot of kind of outrage on Twitter and online comment threads, which I have to admit to taking part in some of them. But I think that what it did bring up was that I think that people, the designers engaging in this realm, do need to be very careful and sensitive towards the subject matter that they're dealing with, and or they can get into hot water quite easily. So I wonder if you can kind of comment on, or perhaps highlight some of those issues that I mean, I think in case that I could just enlighten the audience of one brief example, the one that I know best, which was Bert and Nita's project that I'm going to butcher the title, but it's something like
Republic of Salvation.
Republic of Salvation, that's right. And essentially it was a discursive design project which was just looking at the future of food in relation to work and food shortages, and the proposition of the work was that in a kind of dystopian future, we may encounter a situation where our food is essentially rationed based on the kind of work that we need to do. So if you're a builder, then you're given a lot of high protein food, but it might not be particularly nice food. Anyway, so the way that this kind of became part of a debate was that Paolo Antonelli from MoMA and Jamer Hunt from Parsons put together a project called Design and Violence, which largely exists online, although there's a book as well. And the way that they did this was to select certain projects and then have a writer kind of comment on the project. And the sort of fairly eminent design writer and critic,
John Thackra?
John Thackra, I'm sorry, I had a blank right there. Wrote a fairly scathing response, but which really, I think, was, to my mind, rather missed the point. But the point that he was making was essentially, these are there are people out there in the world who are starving now. So why are you making a discursive project that doesn't address the real issues of food shortage? I was frustrated because I know that John Thackra knows an awful lot about discursive design. He knew exactly what Bert and Nita were doing, and I thought it was kind of a cheap shot. But it did open up, I think, a wider debate about, just this point: what can and should discursive design deal with, and what should it not?
So This makes me think about the time where I entered into anthropology, and they were going through their reflexive turn, where they were beginning to look as anthropology as a field, like what are we actually doing? What is field work? Are we really helping people? Are we just appropriate? We're using them for our academic advancement. And there was really sort of a look and a turn inward with the field. And I see that after 20 years that's kind of what's happening now, especially with the decolonizing design movement, which has been very sort of pronounced in this area. So I think part of it is it makes sense that we're like when you have no agency or impact, then no one really cares about you. And the fact that this is coming, I think it sort of says that, okay, we actually can have some, there is some impact, so we need to be, so we're sort of getting criticized at that point. So I think in a way that's good. So I'm completely happy to have that, because I think that we're better when we're self-critical, and we probably haven't had that. The issue with, and John Thackeray sort of got at this. I don't know if it was Cameron Tonkinwise or someone else, but I've heard it many times about this issue of that here we have designers that are creating dystopias that are realities other places in the world, and how wrong, insensitive, et cetera, that is. And there's a footnote in the book, because I actually don't agree with that. I actually think that we have I think you have the ability to critique your own community, and so for me that's fine. The fact that it is a reality somewhere else, I think is in some ways secondary to that. So that's a perspective that I have, and because it's very relative too. Because you could say, oh, you're in Brazil and you're doing this project that's dystopic for Brazil, but what about Bhutan? And Bhutan is poorer than Brazil, so do you not have permission to do that? So it gets into this sort of this a little bit of a problem of relativism with that. So that's an example where I don't necessarily see that as being the case. But if you look at Naughty Objects, so Naughty Objects was an MIT, KNOTTY. It was at MIT maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I think. Mm-hmm. And there was a discussion there between Ahmed Ansari, who was at Carnegie Mellon with actually Cameron Tonkinwise when he was there. And then he was debating Jamer Hunt too. And it was kind of this issue a little bit, I think, with what John Thacker was getting at, is okay, why are designers working in this discursive way when we have all these real problems in the world? So it's kind of pitting discursive design against sort of a socially responsible design, and that was the argument. And I think that's a great argument to have. I think that's what we should be doing, and we should be looking at where as an individual designer, where we want to begin to put our efforts. I actually believe that there's a power in discursive design, and then in the book we use this idea of the first revolution, and it's a reference to Gil Scott Heron's the revolution will not be televised, and basically he gets at the idea that it's not, the revolution isn't what you see on TV. Right, that's televised. The revolution is actually the intellectual change, the change of mind that happened that was the precedent for that. So it's really, action in the world happens only after change in thinking. So that's where the value, I think, of discursive design in that place is you're not going to have change in the world, action in the world, without a change in thinking, and that's the realm that discursive design can play. So that's how I look at the value of that. But I think each designer, and that's what we encourage our students to do, where do you want to work? And that's why the 4 fields is kind of helpful to begin to think of it. It's a sort of very simple way to where do you want most of your effort to be? What seems to make sense and fit on? But that's, I see the value of discursive design in that way, just the way I see the value of responsive design. It's just a different approach, but I wouldn't necessarily say that one field is more deserving than another, right? You could certainly make the commercial field has made incredible, right? Without that financial incentive, that a lot of the things that have actually helped, let's say in developing countries, have actually come out of sort of commercial projects that have allowed whether it's cheap the economy of scales that get the mosquito netting or things like that. So I wouldn't claim that one field is necessarily more virtuous than the other. But it's a question you need to ask yourself as a designer where you want to be in that place.
Yeah, I think that's the key point, isn't it? It should be up to you to do that. And if you sort of shift it sideways into writing, it would seem unfair for, say, journalists to attack fiction writers. Because both can have impact in the world.
Right. I think it's probably I think we're a victim of our ability in that way, right? Because like you don't say to a songwriter, "What are you doing writing songs?" Why aren't you out there doing something else? You're wasting your time writing songs. Whether they could be, socially responsible, emblematic songs that really, that are that part of activist songs essentially, right? But I think product design especially is sort of a victim because we can actually have a very direct utility. So I think in some ways the criticisms are because we're not using that utility in that way, but it's because we have that capacity. What I say, kind of extra capacity that a poet or a editorial writer or someone else doesn't necessarily have that same type of utility. But just because we have that extra capacity, does that mean that we can't participate in this other realm that that could still, I think, do some good in the world?
Absolutely, great. Well, I want to turn to you, and we have there is a microphone floating around. I'm going to get this one as well. If you have a question, please raise your hand now. Yes, Aldo.
Hi, my name is Aldo, and it was an honor to meet you, sir, earlier. So I wrote down my question because it's a long one. As technology becomes more complex and people become more conscious of its implications, I'm referring specifically to the recent privacy issues that we had at Google, Facebook, and all of that. Is the future of design to combine speculative design or discursive design and design for profit because it addresses a wider audience? I'm saying this as speculative designers seem more concerned with the ethics of new technologies than designers that design solely for commercial purposes. Besides, let's face it, people are more likely to know Philip Stark than speculative designers. Yeah. And in the future, though, speculative designers might be the new commercial designers. What do you think about that? And I'm asking both of you.
Good. I'm glad Tim be on that too. I don't know. I guess I'm a little pessimistic in terms of they would be the new commercial designers. I think that what we've seen is like Google's an example, right? They have who's the guy from the Near Future Laboratory that works at Google X? The British guy, Nick. Yeah, Nick. Yeah, Nick Foster. So that's a perfect example of someone who's working within a large company who's actually doing some discursive design work. So I think these companies are or can begin to employ those in very different ways, right? That's the other thing is like, is it for branding? Like I showed that epidermis thing. Is it baked into the research? Is it sort of, in this case, it seemed like a little bit of a rogue thing that maybe Google didn't quite know about because he had some independence by doing this video about sort of the future of data privacy or something. It kind of, and I think earlier this year it's kind of made the rounds as like, oh, look what Google's thinking. And again, it was kind of a misunderstanding of what the project was. It was sort of a speculative sort of poking at this sort of like, oh, just because we can, should we kind of thing, versus like, oh, we should do this, and that was the misinterpretation. But so for me, the future is that we begin to see the value of this kind of work, and companies are able to bring it in. There is this question. I mean, like, and are we losing the sort of initial value when companies start to use this stuff? I mean, that's a fair question to begin to ask, and I think, yeah, we are. But I think that's what happens when you're successful in anything, right? That people begin to appropriate this and they begin to use this for whatever, and I don't think you can control that. So I think, yes, that it will be increasingly part, and again, speculative design specifically in terms of strategic foresight, because there's already a connection there. But I don't know that it's going to displace this primary drive for profit, because it's largely sort of pitted against that in a way, or it's used because it's baked in to help companies, figure out how to get more profit, like the Philips example that I showed. So.
Yeah, I think in your question you made a statement that discursive designers are perhaps more likely to think about the ethics of new technology than commercial designers. And I don't know, I would be a little bit careful about those kind of judgments, because ultimately thinking about the ethics of the future should absolutely be the realm of commercial designers. And if someone who's working at somewhere like Apple, thinking about how the phone is going to operate in the future, how all of the various devices that are capable of listening to us or taking our data and using it, if those people are not thinking about the ethics of these things, then we're going to be in even more trouble than we're in now. So I think that, of course, thinking about the ethics of things and making objects about them is already part of discursive design. But I think it's very important that for the commercial realm to improve, that some of the kind of reflection that is perhaps more common in discursive design permeates even more than it is doing already.
I mean, we kind of need agents within and without of these structures, and because you can do some work. There's some things you can do outside of a corporate structure that you can't do inside, and vice versa. But this is part of I think what we were thinking about is the short-sightedness of the original sort of presentation of critical design, and how it was pitted against corporations. Yes, absolutely. There's limits to what you can do when you're under that when you're in a commercial structure, but there are also advantages to that structure as well. And I think for me, that's why crowdfunding is a particularly interesting area, because you're within a commercial context and you're able to leverage the thousands of new eyeballs a day that come to those platforms, and you can be provisional. Like, you don't have to have this work out, and they're relatively low bars. Like, a company would never, or there are companies that would never support certain projects because they're too controversial, but in a crowdfunding platform you can do those certain things. So I think there are these other models for these kinds of engagement that can actually leverage some of the corporate stuff. And I would love for Kickstarter to have like a discursive category, that that's sort of, I think of the future and think about where, what could happen. And it's like, that would be really, interesting if they were able to do that. I think powerful, right? Because it would be them using their platform to actually help get some of these ideas out in the world. And potentially if they're earnest, and they're not just there to use the platform for sort of eyeballs, that actually could be a way that a discursive designer might actually make a living, right? That you could actually really control the types of work that you do, and there's a commercial component to that, and then you're again doing more of that work, and that sort of maybe gets at the idea of like, how do we begin to make more change and different things that begin to evolve. So for me, crowdfunding is interesting, and actually that's what the class I talked about with the reparations is we're doing a crowdfunding platform. So it's kind of weird. I have no idea where it's going to go, but yeah, we're trying to leverage a crowdfunding platform for that particular discourse. So.
Great. Send us the link.
Yeah.
David? There's a microphone to your left. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to ask you about discursive design in terms of its limits and its scope, and any concern you might have along the lines of the edge of discursive design. If we think of design as somehow, maybe in some kind of speculative way, having originally to do with objects, and then it sort of goes in the direction of processes and contexts and situations where we're designing experiences and what have you. Insofar as discursive design is situated in the notion, in the idea, is there a sense that you have in your own experience that that a designer is becoming, I don't know how to quite say it, but something of a philosopher, so general that it begins to get outside of the field of material design, and it somehow becomes so generalized as to become somehow imperial.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually, we're interviewing Paola Antonelli about this, and her perspective on that's actually what a designer was in Italy when she was studying in the 60s, is that you were equal philosopher as you were a designer. So I think that might be there might be some historic precedents for this space that we're in now. But yeah, I think it's an issue, but it seems like discursive design is not going to take over the three other fields, at least if we've done that. So it is going to be, an element to what a designer can do. So for me, there's no danger that design is losing what it has always had, and you could. There's lots of arguments for what it's always had has not been so good, in terms of the propagation of and feeding consumerism and all these sort of other sort of commercial critiques of those things. But for me, it's another option for a designer to begin to work in a different way, to engage with the social in a way that you can't do if you're in a commercial frame or even a responsible frame in some ways. So I'm not concerned about it because I don't think it will ever.
Do you sense maybe some kind of schism where you maybe as a designer you looked upon as too remote from, and not even a designer?
This is it gets at a little bit of the art design question, although maybe we're looking at philosopher design question. But I mean, that's what Dunn and Raby were hit with, right away. So it's in a way, it's a kind of very old question. Like, what is the relationship of this new way of working to traditional ways of working? And so for me, it's not problem. I mean, we can talk about the difference between art and design, and Dunn and Raby sort of had to defend why this is design and not art.